Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Jackie Hoyt, and I'm the president of the board of the Johann Fust Library Foundation. It is wonderful to see all of you here, as well as those that are participating on our live stream service. And thank you for your ongoing support of our beautiful library. At today's Literary Series event, we are honored to welcome award-winning author and journalist Lance Morrow. We are grateful to have Lance through Jane Jeunesse, and therefore, we believe there is no one better than her to introduce him at today's event. Jane Fletcher Jeunesse is a beloved literary advisor to the Johann Fust Library Foundation. She is a former reporter with the New York Times and author of 3 books, a novel and 2 biographies. In 1999, her book, Passionate Nomad, was published by Random House. It was a New York Times notable book and was a finalist for the Penn Martha Albrand Award. This deeply researched biography chronicles Freya Stark's adventures in dangerous regions of the Middle East in the 20th century. In 2008, her second biography, American Priestess, The Extraordinary Story of Anna Spafford and the American Colony in Jerusalem, was published by Nane Talese Doubleday. The book was widely praised and further cemented Jane's renown as Middle Eastern scholar. Everyone here at the Johann Fust Library Foundation revels in Jane's company. She is a constant source of literary inspiration for all of us. Before I turn the microphone over to Jane so she can introduce Lance, I have a few quick housekeeping items. If you haven't done so already, please silence your cell phones. And after Lance speaks, he will answer questions from the audience. We have his book, God and Mammon, on sale here. And after the Q&A, Lance will sign books. So without further ado, I present to you Jane Jeunesse.
That's very high praise. Thank you so much. It's my joy to be occasionally giving advice, but nobody ever takes it, which is always my sorrow, to the library. But I enjoy it so much, and I enjoy all of you, and I enjoy being here, and I very much enjoy presenting Lance Morrow. And so many of you know exactly who he is. You've read him for years. You've seen that byline in Time magazine. Now you're probably reading him in the Wall Street Journal. Am I not doing it right?
Oh, no, you're good.
Oh, good.
Here, hold it.
Well, sure, I'll hold it. The wicked little thing, it always gives me trouble. So maybe I should, before I tell you of all of Lance's multiple achievements, I should say that we had dinner last night. And not just with Lance, but with his marvelous wife, Susan Brand Morrow, who is going to be speaking on Thursday. And it was a very lively dinner. Nobody left for the longest time. But it was so interesting. That night I lay in bed and I thought that Lance had often, he covered the Vietnam War, he covered Bosnia. He often, in the Middle East, stayed at the American Colony Hotel in Jerusalem. And I have written about the American Colony Hotel in Jerusalem, and it's a very bizarre story. But that showed a kinship that I also shared with Susan, who I hope you will come and hear. She's a remarkable woman and a scholar, a classicist, a linguist. But she has traveled in some of the lands that are certainly not, you wouldn't say they're poor, but they are poor, but they're so rich in their long histories. This is Egypt, southern Egypt, Sudan, and in my Freya Stark book was about the same kinds of adventures and for example, funny adventures, such as Susan describing arriving at a ferry in a remote spot, needing to cross a body of water, and to catch the ferry was the way to do it. And she arrived at the back of a large crowd of people, and she was lifted up bodily with no comment really, and just carried over the tops of all these men to the ferry because they said, you shouldn't have to wait in line. And this happened to Freya Stark, so I'm always sorry that I was never carried over to the heads of a line. But anyway, so it was a very happy dinner that we had last night. As I say, you all are going to be familiar with Lance's work. He has for decades, wrote for Time magazine, and it was usually Lance who wrote the Person of the Year that we all waited in high excitement to see who it would be. And he also, I should comment on his having read some of Lance's books, and I do recommend God and Mammon, which is an examination of the complexities of American society. We do love God and we do love money. And he's examining this as he does. His disposition is to examine all the peculiarities of American culture and society and look at it from the ethical and moral point of view, which is very useful in these disturbing days. And God and Mammon is almost a cri de coeur for civility and freedom, the right kind of freedom. It's a very powerful book. But there is no surprise that he is a wordsmith. His mother was a syndicated columnist in Washington, and his father was also an editor before he worked for Nelson Rockefeller as an advisor and also speechwriter. And I suppose you could say that politics was in Lance's blood, because as a little boy, he was a page in the Senate, along with Pam Miles' husband, Mike. Isn't that marvelous? I think it's wonderful. So he graduated very well indeed from Harvard in 1963. Then he worked for the Washington Star, and then Time found him, and that was 60 years, a long time. His writing is lively, amusing, filled with literary references and wisdom and wit. So he's a great writer. I recommend, he has a new book coming out on Henry Luce, who influenced all of our lives and our culture, and that's what Lance is examining. He is currently the Henry Grunwald Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Institute in Washington. And again, it is the moral dimensions of public events that captivate him and he examines. And now, instead of traveling, neither of them, Susan no longer in deep Egypt or Sudan, Lance no longer staying at the American Colony Hotel. They live in Geneva, which is not in Switzerland, but in the Finger Lakes district in northern New York. And Lance is contending with mice, but not too much. And it's the house is warm. It's very old, but he has a moral story about mice because everything has a moral dimension for Lance. Anyway, so I recommend that you come up here, Lance, and take this microphone. And what a pleasure to have you.
Excellent, thank you.
Take my thing.
Thank you very much, Jane. I'm sorry you brought up the mice. I'm going to regret that column for the rest of my life. I did this on an impulse. I did this really sort of stupid column about 3 or 4 weeks ago. But it was what they published was only 2/3 of the piece. There was 1/3 they left off, in which I got very fancy and drawing as a parable and blah blah blah. And they said, no, we'll stick with the mice. So this is really stupid column that, oh well, every so often that happens. Thank you very much, Jane, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for all of you for coming and for the invitation to this extraordinary library, this really beautiful place. I'm afraid I'm going to give a slightly eccentric talk, and I confess that there's a little bait and switch involved here, because the books over there on the table are God and Mammon, about American money, but it occurred to me that our minds are so much on what is happening in Ukraine and Russia, and really the change in the world that we are witnessing, that I wanted to actually to talk about that and to refer back to a book which I wrote some 20 years ago on the very unpleasant subject of evil, because I wanted to think a bit about what is going on in Ukraine. This extraordinary thing is just, we're going on a month now. There's the Russian warships are shelling Mariupol from the sea. There are forest fires around Chernobyl as we speak. The Ukrainians are still holding their own, but it's unclear on how all of this is going to come out. And overall, the situation, of course, looms the question of nuclear possibilities, and the question of, in my mind, how Vladimir Putin is going to get out of what seems to have been a tremendous miscalculation on his part, miscalculation of his own army's capabilities against the Ukrainians, a misjudgment of the Ukrainian forces' will to fight and the Ukrainian people's will to fight, a misjudgment of NATO, a misjudgment of Joe Biden, a misjudgment of the world. So I wanted to, as I say, speak somewhat eccentrically, and in a way quite personally and subjectively about all of this. It's the theologians have long made a distinction between natural evil and moral evil. Natural evil, of course, is earthquake and forest fire and that kind of thing. Moral evil is premeditated murder, genocide, that kind of thing. It is a bizarre circumstance of our time that we have had first 2 years of natural evil in the form of COVID and the pandemic that has killed millions, and now a moral evil in the form of this Russian invasion of Ukraine. For a somewhat personal side of this, the sight of the young mothers, Ukrainian mothers and their children fleeing in shelters under bombardment took me back many years to September of 1959, when I showed up in Harvard Yard to claim my room in a suite in Matthews Hall in the freshman class, the class of '63. And I discovered on arriving that my two roommates were, number one, a Ukrainian, and number two, a Hungarian. And I wanted to tell you about them. The world is in a new reality and in a new place now. One feels this. I think we all sense this. And yet we are in an old place. We've been in a place we've been before. As one of the things that happens with the passage of years is you notice the repetition of patterns. You begin seeing things happening again. Repetitions with variations, morphic resonances. You see the same thing in a slightly different guise. My Ukrainian roommate was a dashing guy he had a certain Cossack swagger about him. He had a mustache, and he became very popular at Wellesley and Radcliffe. He was quite a guy. And his story was this, that he was about my age. He was born very early in the war. His father was killed by Stalin, by Stalin's henchman, Nikita Khrushchev, who was running the show for Stalin in Ukraine. I'm not sure exactly why he was killed, but nobody in those, no one on those long lists of Stalin's had to be killed for any particular, thanks. There need not have been any particular reason for those names to have been on the proscribed list. As a matter of fact, Khrushchev and people like him in other parts of the Soviet Union would negotiate. They had, said they would have 1,500 names on the people of people who had to be killed, and they said, no, it's not enough. The vozhd, the leader, the guide, Stalin, Koba the Dread, Stalin needs 2,500. And so they'd start haggling over, they needed an extra 900. So let's go. So Danilo, his name was Danilo Sviatoslav Struk, and Dan's father was on the list and he was killed. Dan's mother takes Dan, this is in a year or two, takes Dan, and just like, when I see these women in the railroad stations now and in the bomb shelters in Ukraine, I see Dan and his mother. Dan and his mother, they made their way across through the Russian armies, over into the German lines, across the German lines, to the American lines. And his mother apparently was supporting them by telling fortunes, reading tarot cards, that kind of thing. But she must have been an extraordinary person to have gotten the two of them through. And I see the same stories are at work in what's happening now, although I must say the services for refugees are infinitely, she was going through war zones. So they got to the United States one way or another. They were in refugee camps and so on. And they settled in New Jersey in the Ukrainian emigre community in New Jersey. Dan did very well in school. He got a scholarship to Rutgers Prep. And at Rutgers Prep, he did brilliantly and got a scholarship to Harvard. So he showed up at Matthews Hall the same day I did in 1959. Dan graduated from Harvard with high honors. He became, I never knew anybody who loved literature as much as Dan did. And he and I translated a bunch of Ukrainian writers. He educated me and Shevchenko, who was the national poet of Russia, of Ukraine. And we translated short story. Dan would render them into English, into rough English, and then I would polish them. He went on to graduate school. He became a distinguished professor of Slavic languages and literatures at the University of Toronto. And the great labor of his life was what is called the Encyclopedia of Ukraine, which is a mammoth work still in progress. Dan died one night about 20 years ago of a heart attack in Munich when he was at an academic conference. They couldn't save him. But the Encyclopedia of Ukraine goes on, and in the encyclopedia, they are gathering every scrap of every biography of every detail of Ukrainian culture and life and history, precisely with the aim, the rather large, grand aim of refuting every Russian, like Putin, who says that Ukraine isn't really a country, that it's just part of the Russian Empire. So Dan had a very admirable life in the cause of Ukraine, and he was an ardent, you could call it nationalist, but without any sinister implication. He was an extraordinary champion of Ukrainian literature and culture. My other roommate was Hungarian, Derek. And Derek was in his mid-teens in 1956 when the Russian tanks rolled into Budapest. And Derek and his family packed up little suitcases, and they packed up the father's extremely valuable stamp collection and put that into the suitcase. And they walked out, and they got to Austria, they got to Vienna, and eventually through refugee agencies and so on, they made it to New York. And Derek got a scholarship to a good New York prep school, Birch Wathen, and he did very well there, and he got a scholarship to New York, and so he turned up at Matthews Hall on the same day that Dan and I did, and we spent the next 4 years together. Derek went on to Harvard Medical School. He became a very successful doctor, and he's retired now. I just got an email from him yesterday, and he ran a number of he became a sort of medical administrator, and he ran a number of very large hospitals in various parts of the country and the world. I thought about these guys and I think of them now because of what is happening in Ukraine and what Putin has done. Where are we with Putin? I think we're in a state of extraordinary suspension and a very unusual historic uncertainty and suspension obviously because of the enormous single fact of the Russian nuclear weapons, which alter the calculus and determine everything that Biden does and NATO does and the rest of the world does because of the threat. And so there's the nukes, and then there's Putin himself. What is this all about? And John Mearsheimer, for example, the University of Chicago political scientist, has written several articles in the Economist and the New Yorker, in which he has somewhat put the blame on NATO and the United States for pushing Putin a little too hard, encroaching, having too much NATO, too many new members of NATO, encroaching upon the Soviet sphere and approaching and the historical Russian sensitivity to the need for a buffer, to the reason for the Eastern Bloc and so on. So Mearsheimer and others have taken that position. I have lost track of the conservative American theology on this because I don't know. There is some agreement on that with that thesis. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is Putin is crazy. So, and then and you get that from I noticed in the New Yorker a few days ago, Nina Khrushcheva, who's Nikita Khrushchev's great-granddaughter, said she thinks that Putin is bananas. And this is, of course, a widely retailed theory. There are people who have said that he's changed, that he's undergone a personality change. Maybe it's COVID. There are these unbelievable videos of Putin on this table that looks like it's 50 feet long, and the flunkies at one end and Putin at the other, and just an extraordinary a picture that sort of tells you a great deal about isolation and autocracy, and makes you very nervous about what we're looking at in Putin. My theory is when you look at Putin or someone like Putin, you need to, I was talking to my sister the other night, who's a doctor, and I said, is there an optical instrument, or can you fantasize an optical instrument with which you would look? The eye, of course, is part of the brain itself. So suppose that I wanted to look through the eye into the brain, and I wanted to see the thought content. I wanted to see everything down to the historically, culturally, emotionally, and so on. And I thought about that for a while. My sister couldn't come up with a good medical term, or invent a good medical term. But I thought that what I was really talking about was Herodotus. Herodotus, as you know, was passionately devoted to finding out absolutely everything about, for example, the deep causes of a war, of the Persian conflicts with the Greeks and so on. But also, he was called the father of history, but I think he's just as accurately called the father of journalism. A lot of people also called him the father of lies. But he wanted to know everything about a people, its customs, its habits, its dreams, its fears, it's the way they buried their dead, the way that they got married, all of these things. And so I developed a fancy of something called the Herodotus Scan. And what would it be like if you ran the Herodotus Scan on Vladimir Putin? What would you find there? What would you? George W. Bush said he looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul. Biden said he looked into his eyes and he said, "You have no soul." And to which Putin replied, "We understand each other." But suppose you did look in, suppose there's a soul there and you looked into it with the Herodotus Scan, what would you find there? Well, I would go back and say I'm looking at traces of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan united the nomadic tribes into one, of Northeast Asia into one fighting force. I would say that I find Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Grozny, even and terrible. Grozny is not just terrible in the sense of monster, but terrible in the sense of awe-inspiring, um, to be feared, to be mighty, and so on. So, and I think it seems to me that in Putin there are these ingredients of, to call it grandiosity doesn't begin to cover it, but it's a particular quality that you would say was also present in Peter the Great, who was a sort of Jekyll Hyde figure, that is, a great modernizer and Enlightenment man, at the same time capable of monstrous brutality. He tortured and killed his own son. He had a lot of blood on his hands, and yet he was paradoxically this great rational figure. And above all, I think that in Putin you would find Joseph Stalin. And I think that the same Stalin who killed Dan Struk's father, and whose Stalinism drove Derek and his family out of Budapest. And I think that quality, I suppose there was a very interesting article by a Romanian scholar who now teaches at Texas Tech, named the American pronunciation, I don't know the Romanian, but the American pronunciation would be Kostica Bradatan. And he sought to explain Putin. He wrote this piece at the time Putin took over Crimea in 2014. Bradatan said, what we are looking at in Putin is Smerdyakofism. Smerdyakov, the half-brother of the brothers Karamazov, the guy who hanged cats for amusement when he was a kid, the guy who tortured animals. Dostoevsky, of course, was fascinated by Smerdyakofism. He was fascinated by a certain kind of crushing cruelty, and the purpose of it, the ultimate purpose of it, is, I don't know, it's absolute dominance, absolute control, which, when you consider the Russian nuclear arsenal, Smerdyakofism makes you very, very, very nervous, because how does Smerdyakov back down off the drive for absolute dominance? How does that trait, if this is correct, and it sounds to me like it's got some truth in it. And Putin, God knows, I don't, who knows what goes on, but in his head. But there is this. It feels right to me that there's this Smerdyakov, this cruelty, this. He's a terrific risk taker, Putin is, but it seems to me there, and there certainly was in Stalin. I mean, Putin is Stalin on the sixth carbon. I mean, Stalin was a monster times 10 in so much of what he did. On the other hand, I don't know if you're all familiar with the case of Walter Duranty of the New York Times, who was the best known and foreign correspondent in the world in 1930, 31, 32. And he won a Pulitzer Prize for international reporting in 1932 for his reports extravagantly praising Stalin for the way he was handling Russia and its affairs in the world. Now, this is at exactly the same time that Stalin was starving the people in Ukraine, the kulaks and so on, to death by taking all their grain away from them because they had refused to collectivize. And so nobody knows the exact figure of how many were killed, but 5 million, 10 million. It's somewhere between 5 million and 10 million people died in Ukraine and the Upper Caucasus because of Stalin's policies. And so this has made Walter Duranty a bad guy for years and years in the annals of journalism. And as a matter of fact, some claim that his Pulitzer Prize winning reports in 1932 on Stalin were the worst act of journalism in the 20th century. But if you look, on the other hand, I wanted to talk about the complexity of some of this, because if you look at Stalin and Duranty in detail, you begin to see, so to speak, the dilemmas of evil. And this was Stalin's dilemma with which Duranty sympathized. Both men used the expression, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. Well, 5 million or 10 million eggs is a lot of eggs. That's quite an omelet. But the dilemma was this, that the Soviet Union had to industrialize at a breakneck speed. It had to advance itself industrially and become a great power because of the threat of Germany, among other things, and they right next door. And by the way, Ukraine is right in the way, in the path. So his dilemma, his need, was to collectivize the farms in order to get enough grain to feed the workers in the industries to bring Russia up to strength as a world power. So it was not just sadism that prompted this. It was, of course, bureaucratic ineptitude on a titanic scale. But and Walter Duranty, who was, contrary to the legend, a very interesting man. He was neurotic and screwed up in a lot of ways, but he was a very interesting character. And when I started looking into Duranty and Stalin and this particular thing, I was interested in those complexities that one was encountering, huge issues of this irreconcilable issues. And it seems to me that Putin's mind works kind of in this way, in the sense that he sees necessities, grand imperial Russian necessities that require, for example, the invasion of Ukraine. The future, he sees himself in world historical terms, I believe, and he sees it as necessary for him to practice Smerdyakofism because that's a way to win. If you can't win, and obviously he's got a lot of competence problems in his army. I mean, they're inexplicable failures of logistics, and so you have to. I'm afraid that his answer is brutality and Smerdyakofism, and just smashing and leveling and smashing and leveling. But that, I think he sees the dilemma rather in the way that Stalin and Durante too saw the dilemma of collectivizing and so on. Malcolm Muggeridge, who was an English Manchester Guardian journalist and a committed communist, or socialist anyway, at the time he was sent out to Russia around 1931-32, he and his wife Kitty sold their furniture in England because they planned on spending the rest of their lives in the Soviet paradise. They were going to uproot, and the Soviet Union was absolutely wonderful, and that's where they wanted to be. But as soon as Malcolm Muggeridge got to Moscow, he began to smell a rat, and he started following the smell. And he, unlike Durante, he actually got on a train and went to Ukraine and took a look at what was happening. And what he saw was lots of people starving. And so he wrote a series for the Manchester Guardian, and where Durante won a Pulitzer Prize for his reports, Muggeridge was shunned by other leftists who said he was a traitor to the cause, and why was he publishing all this negative publicity about the Vozhd, about Stalin and the famine and so on. Anyway, that is. I wanted to. I think that's part of the. A question that Putin raises for me is, and given all this and all back and forth, I mean, would you say that you're looking at evil here? I was in 1996, when I was working for Time magazine, a man named Hamilton went into a primary school in Dunblane, Scotland, and opened fire and killed 16 little children, and plus one of their teachers. And I used the word, I wrote an essay for Time about this incident, and I used the word evil. And a very civilized medical doctor wrote to me and said, "You're an idiot. Why would you," the man was obviously psychopathic, "why would you use a crude, stupid, primitive term like evil?" Well, I ask you, I mean, would you use that term? I was so interested in the question of what the word evil means and whether one should use it, that I wrote this book about evil. I just I can tell you a story about. I developed the habit of asking people I knew. I said, "Tell me something. Have you ever met anybody whom you considered to be evil?" And almost invariably, they would sort of look off and they would say, "Not really. It's not really." And then they would say, "Of course, there's Hitler, but I didn't know him." And so one time I was talking to William F. Buckley Jr., and we were sitting at lunch, and I said, "Say, have you ever known anybody who you considered to be evil?" And he didn't miss a beat. He said, "Well, Gore Vidal." He did that, and I laughed when he said that, and I looked at him, and he wasn't laughing. He wasn't. His eyes. He had a way of when he was being inscrutable. His eyes looked almost like they were as if they were enameled. That was and I got the enamel eye back from him. So anyway.
But there are acts of evil.
What?
There are acts of evil, even if one wants to
Yes, well, I parse things like that. I say, well, uh, would you call people acts of evil and so on? Can I read you just a passage of the book? Just oops. Are they? Oh, they are. How did you get this?
I thought they were mine. Is that an act of evil?
Oh, I thought getting your cataracts fixed meant that your life would be simpler, but you have one for the computer and one. Anyway, um, well, there's a quote from T.S. Eliot which I meant to read earlier, but which I suppose expresses my point of view. He says, "The world turns and the world changes, but one thing does not change. However you disguise it, this one thing does not change, the perpetual struggle of good and evil." And we could have an argument about that too, but I think that, anyway, let me read a little of just framing the terms. Evil is a strange, versatile, and dangerous word that can be used to describe a genocide or to incite one, as in, let's kill all of the so-and-so because they're evil. Black magic envelops the word. Now you see it, now you don't. Many people do not believe evil exists. It is a subjective word, and yet describes objective realities, massacres, great wrongs, holocausts. Evil is the ne plus ultra, the doomsday word. Nothing can be more evil than evil. The Inuit supposedly have all those words for snow. It is difficult to find one suitable synonym in English for evil. Wickedness is close, but not the same. My conclusion is that it is ultimately not possible to understand evil. Mine is a traditional point of view that echoes Augustine's line about evil: do not seek to know more than it is appropriate. I come at evil with the thought of Jung in mind, and this is what I was talking about a minute ago. Paradox, this is a quote from Jung, paradox is one of our most valuable spiritual possessions, while uniformity of meaning is a sign of weakness. Hence, a religion becomes inwardly impoverished when it loses or waters down its paradoxes, but the multiplication enriches because only the paradox comes anywhere near to comprehending the fullness of life. Non-ambiguity and non-contradiction are one-sided and thus unsuited to express the incomprehensible. That's the end of the Jung quote. But it is possible to describe evil. Evil is vivid and dramatic. Some think that evil is the most interesting thing about human beings, evil and humor, perhaps. The trouble comes in trying to understand evil. When people become frustrated in their effort to do so, they are inclined to say that because they do not understand evil, it does not exist, a somewhat self-important fallacy based on the thought that what I do not understand cannot be real. Evil has made a successful career over many centuries by persuading people that it does not exist. Evil evolves. It has a talent for adaptation. It keeps up with history and technology. The word evil and the idea of evil have become pertinent from a new angle. A door has opened into another dimension. The idea of evil has to be rethought in that dimension under new conditions. A lively awareness of evil, once part of any healthy mind, must be reinstalled in the consciousness of the West, and so on. So I wind up calling evil the tabloid branch of the humanities, which I thought is not a bad name. I thought of another story that I wanted to tell before. How am I doing on? Yeah, I think I'm.
I think people would love to ask questions too.
Yeah. I just well, let me tell one story about. I was talking one time to Henry Kissinger about, and don't ask me how, but we were talking about Richard Nixon's drinking habits, and Nixon was famous for he didn't hold liquor very well, and he one or two drinks and his eyes would get a little wet and his voice would be slurry. And Kissinger said, there was Bernstein and Woodward in their book on the final days talked about how Nixon would call Kissinger late at night, and when he'd been drinking alone in his hideaway office. And Kissinger said, listen, he said, if he, and Nixon would call and he said, I don't go to that now. I want you to bomb him, Henry. I want you to bomb him. And Kissinger laughed and he said, listen, if we had bombed every country that Richard Nixon told us to bomb, the world would be a wasteland. What do you think? I remain ambivalent about the use of the word evil, and sometimes I think it's not helpful when you're trying to solve problems and so on. On the other hand, it has a word with a long human pedigree, and it certainly invites use in a situation like this one, when you watch your television set and you see this incredibly wanton, and wanton is an interesting word that I think is applicable, is wanton, just wanton killing of innocent people. And so one, Mitt Romney one day says Putin is evil. Ben Sass the next day says Putin is evil. Anchor people on television shows say Putin is evil. It invites the use of the word evil, even though I must say, when you think about it, you say, well, that's not necessarily going to help anything, but maybe it would. So with that, I would ask you if your opinion, or if you have any questions about.
Does anyone have any questions for Lance?
Yeah.
Chris, for the people at home, we do it on a microphone.
Whoops.
Sorry.
Do you think that there's a genetic component of evil? And if there is a genetic component, that sort of takes the onus off the individual who is supposedly committing evil.
Well, that's the tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner, and it ain't true. It's you can understand lots, and without forgiving it. It's genetic. I don't know. I suppose there's not only genetic, but for example, the Aztecs made it a practice to tear the hearts out of hundreds of thousands of sacrificial victims in order to appease the sun. And so that was that evil, or was it just religion? Religious practice and perfectly understandable within the context. In Robinson Crusoe, there's a absolutely fascinating passage where the cannibals periodically visit Robinson Crusoe's island for a feast, for like a holiday feast, and they have some captives, and they cut them up and cook them and eat them, basically. And when Robinson Crusoe first realizes what has happened, he goes into a crazy fit, anger, and says, I want to kill them all. I want to kill all of these monsters. He says, I want to kill them all. I want to kill them all. But then some time passes, and Robinson Crusoe begins to develop a sort of relativistic idea. And he says, well, you know, it's their way. And because it's their way, I won't condemn it. In James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking novels, Natty Bumppo is constantly, he's tied to an Iroquois torture tree. He's like this, and they're about to disembowel him, and he will suddenly launch into a long philosophical disquisition on the ways of the Iroquois, and it's actually very funny, but and he says the word he uses is their gifts. He says, like torture is among the Iroquois gifts. That is their way. That is the way they do things. And who are we? I mean, I'm a paleface, and I don't do those things because I have the ways of the paleface. But who am I to condemn the ways of the Iroquois, who get their kicks by doing these horrible things and eating people and so on? And it's a very interesting question, which then you say, well, what are Vladimir Putin's gifts? What is his way? Well, this is his way. His way is to invade, and because of he's thinking about Greater Russia, he's thinking about, God knows, his legacy and so on, but it does not comprehend the ways of people of the Western democracies. It does not comprehend the ways of those who say that the individual, there are certain universal human rights, that the democracy is, and it does not comprehend the way of freedom. Jane and I were talking about this last night. Freedom as the really quintessential virtue or quality that we're talking about, and freedom is what he is attacking here. He is saying you are not free. You have to, and it is our way to crush you and we will pound Mariupol until we will rocket the maternity hospitals. We will shoot the children in the streets. That is our way to establish our goal. So is that evil? Well, sure, it'll do until something else comes along. I mean, it's yes.
Well, this is so interesting because here,
You need a microphone.
I live in Chicago, and
I'm sorry, can you speak louder?
I live in Chicago. I'm in a discussion group with a group of women, and yesterday our speaker was John Mersheimer.
Oh, really?
And he spoke on Ukraine, so I couldn't believe that, I'm hearing your point of view. But it was interesting because he's very sure of himself. He feels like he has kind of the right idea about what's going on. It was very frightening to me. But he talked a lot about the balance of power.
Yeah, that's his thing, yeah.
Is it his thing? Because
Yeah, balance of power, realpolitik. You're not talking about morality so much as you're talking about balance of power. You're talking
but
about.
that was really the thing, and he said really the mistake, and he said go back and listen to my speech in 2014 because he says he's predicted what's happening
Yes.
now.
Yeah.
But he's very concerned. He said Russia should really be the free world. It should be Europe and Americans.
I'm sorry,
ally.
Russia should be what?
should be our ally and not China's. He said, you know, we're taking the eye off the ball.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
thought that was interesting. He kind of
Yeah,
left
no,
us
it's
with
very
that.
interesting. And,
Yeah, you and I are the same age, and our whole lives we've been afraid of Russia.
yeah, yeah.
You know, China just kind of came out of nowhere. Well, anyway, I just thought it might be interesting that here's another scholar like you.
Yeah, yeah.
And,
Well, he has very articulately expressed the balance of power point of view and the realpolitik. I'm sorry?
it was frightening to all of us the way he left it.
Yeah, well, but it's what's also interesting is the enormous gap between the Mearsheimer point of view and one that looks at this and just says it's evil to attack little. I thought if there was a truism in the world, it would be that it is not good to murder little children, you know. But that's what he's doing. I mean, he's so.
We have another question over here, Lance.
Hi. My question was that I've like seen this quote. I forgot what the exact words are, but it's like everyone, even like the most like quote unquote like evil people, are just doing what they think is best. Do you think that's like virtually true for everyone? Because I know some like, especially like characters in like fiction are just doing evil for the sake of evil, or that's what they say. Do you think even in that they think they're doing what's best? Like,
Well,
do you think that's
what's,
true?
What's best? I mean, what's most fun, or what? I think the motives for doing evil, very, very often people think that they're doing the right thing. They think that they may be involved in evil programs and evil acts, even though what you and I would regard as evil, but they think that they're necessary. I would bring up Stalin's Holodomor, as the Ukrainians say, the Great Famine, the killing of 5 to 10 million Ukrainians and others. He regarded it as a necessity, and he sanctified the necessity. That's one thing about an interesting phrase about Stalin. He sanctified his own necessities. He acted as if his necessities or his desires and so on were sacred, sanctified. But I think the motives for doing evil are many, and you could I think you have to examine them one by one and see what you're talking about. Evil is having written this book about it, it's very hard to write about, because on the one hand you say, oh, nonsense, you know, it's not. But then on the other hand, you get the willies and you say, Justice Potter Stewart in the 1950s was asked the Supreme Court justice was asked the definition of pornography, and he said, "I know it. You know it when you see it." And I believe that evil has some of that same quality. I was in Bosnia one time, in Sarajevo, and I was in a prison. I was visiting a prison where some just monstrous atrocity murderers were being held. And I gotta say, Bosnia was the evilest place I have ever been. It felt, there was a guy named Karadzic who was the leader of the Bosnian Serbs, and I went up to interview him at a school up in the hills, and the guys around him were all about 6'4", 6'5", and they had these incredibly long daggers in their belts, and you knew that those daggers had been used many times. And they would sit in the hills above Sarajevo with sniper rifles, and they would keep themselves drunk on slivovitz, which is plum brandy, and they would keep themselves sort of high just to keep an edge on. And they would just pot-shotting at, a woman coming home with groceries, and they'd sniper scope, and they would be shooting people like that. I have never felt anywhere such a palpable presence of evil as I did in Sarajevo and around around the city and so on. So if you'd asked me on that occasion, is there such a thing as evil? I would say, boy, there's no question in my mind. It's a you know, the Beelzebub, in all the literature of evil, there's a buzz, Beelzebub, you know, zzz, it's kind of, and there's that kind of evil humming. Hannah Arendt had a very interesting line. She wrote a book called Eichmann in Jerusalem, in which she used the phrase, the banality of evil. And her idea was that evil was not some grand, not a big deal the way it is in John Milton and Paradise Lost. And Lucifer is this dark, heroic figure. She said that evil is bureaucratic, shallow, crummy, stupid, third-rate. And Gershom Scholem, who is a great scholar of Jewish mysticism, wrote to her, a friend of hers, but he wrote a very angry letter saying, how dare you, he thought that she was insulting the Jews because her book implied that they hadn't done enough to oppose the Holocaust. And she wrote back and sort of apologizing, but then said, I think evil is like a fungus. I don't think it's profound. It's not profound in the way that Dr. Faust would, that sort of large, heroic conception of Lucifer and so on, but rather evil is like COVID. But it's like a fungus. Is just a something of that kind, shallow and almost impersonal, like Eichmann. Eichmann is a crummy little bureaucrat, and he responsible for the murder of millions of people.
Lance, is this?
It's on.
It's on. Is it on? Yeah.
Yeah.
I heard a priest one time say that it was too bad that everyone who was going to do evil didn't have horns and a tail, so that you would recognize it immediately, which, as you've been explaining, they don't. But, what you've been saying about the background of Putin is so important in all the thought that I've given to what makes someone do something evil. And I've had experience of being in a supermarket, and I see a mother furious at a child because he's crying and he wants something, and she slaps him across the face. And I think, oh my God, that's not evil, but what you're doing is creating something in this child that wants revenge. And all, through life, just on a much simpler level, why does a person become evil? And, walk into a church in South Carolina and shoot people, or walk into a school. Something happened in that person through growing up or childhood, I believe, that set
I think
something.
I certainly take your point, but on the other hand, something happens to people in many of us people who do not, who rather have the opposite. People are so complicated.
That's the great thing. Who soars and who sinks out of adversity.
People can be slapped by their parents or mistreated and abused and so on. And also, that kind of abuse might express it might come out later on in acts of evil by that child or the person who was that child. But on the other hand, it could come out in many other ways: alcoholism, self-destruction, many different. I think it's almost impossible to sort out all you can do is look individual cases like Putin's and see if you can there are these reverberations in people's lives. They're deep reverberations. They're deep influences that are very hard to get at. This is what Herodotus was always was all about. He was so sensitive to the ways he wanted. He didn't judge the people he was writing about. He was interested. He was fascinated by the different ways they did things, and he was ultimately fascinated by their motives for going to war. That was he was on the trail of what, and he would go back generations. Some offense that had been occurred 6 generations earlier had reverberated into the present. So,
Lance, we have.
I wonder how many people here think that JFK was as crazy as a lot of people think Putin is when he insisted that missiles be removed from Cuba and brought us close to nuclear war. And I wonder if people think that civil society can be rallied if there's time against nuclear weapons. We amazingly, we had an opportunity in Reykjavik when Reagan and Gorbachev agreed to get rid of nuclear weapons, but civil society was not organized to back them up. I'm really curious about what you think.
well, what would, I mean, Kennedy was incredibly lucky in October of 1962 in the Cuban Missile Crisis, in that it broke right, and the Khrushchev backed off and so on. You say he was crazy, but if you'd been sitting at that table, Curtis LeMay was at that table. Curtis LeMay is the guy who firebombed Tokyo in April of 1945 and killed in one night 100,000 people. And the city was made of paper and wood, and it just... And Curtis LeMay at that table in 1962 advised, I don't think he was saying use nukes at that time, but he wanted to bomb the hell out of the missile sites in Cuba. And so Kennedy held back, and Bobby Kennedy was doing behind-the-scenes stuff with Dobrynin, the Russian ambassador. But there's no question that Kennedy got very, very lucky and so on. But what do you think that he should have done? Should he have acquiesced to the missiles being there in Cuba? I'm not sure about that.
Well, it would have been nice if there had been transparency.
On whose part?
On both parts.
On what?
On the part of both sides.
Well, it would be...
We agreed to an agreement, but it was not transparent.
Well, because of the Turkish missiles that were...
Well, that's part of it, right?
Yeah. Well, but sometimes you can't do things transparently in that world. I mean, sometimes you have to make a secret deal if you're going to make it work. So I don't know what the answer to your question is. I mean,
I think it's no nukes.
Well, I agree with you. If you can pull that one off.
See, everybody smiles in a patronizing way because it seems like an impossibility. And yet, that's what we need to do. At every opportunity, wherever you are, with friends, at a party, whatever, talk about it, because that's priority one.
Okay, so now we really are long for time, and I think we could go on all evening. It's so fascinating, Lance, just listening to your perspective. We're so fortunate to have the benefit of all of your experience and your process of thinking deeply about these topics. But I'm afraid we only have time for one more question, and it's yours.
Thank you. You know, with these horrible atrocities we see taking place daily now, with Putin bringing to bear on the Ukrainian people, and then the free world trying to thread this very fine line between stopping him or causing a World War III or, worse yet, a nuclear war. In your opinion, are we doing enough? Is the free world doing enough to stop Putin at this point?
Well, let's look at what they're doing. The sanctions are very heavy, and they seem to be doing a tremendous amount of damage. The Stingers and the Javelins that are going into Ukraine are doing an incredible job in destroying the Soviet armor. They've killed over 7,000 Russians in just less than a month, which is amazing. They have declined to impose a no-fly zone, and I think they're probably right about that, because that's the kind of thing that could get into acts of war and therefore set up a nuclear exchange. I suspect. And furthermore, it seems that the Ukrainians are flying very effectively. It's a little like the Battle of Britain, in that the Ukrainian pilots are being very effective in controlling, or at least keeping, the Russians from getting control of the air. So I think I think Biden's been doing a pretty good job, and I think it's a fine line to walk. I mean, Grant, I think it was Grant, one time was his officers were coming to him, and they were in Virginia, and the officers were saying, well, if we do that, you know, Lee's gonna do so-and-so, and if we do that, Lee's gonna do so-and-so. And Grant got angry and said, I'm sick of hearing what Lee's gonna do to us. I want you to tell me what we're gonna do to Lee, and I want Lee to worry about what I'm gonna do to him. And I wish one could say that now. Say, I'm sick of worrying about what Putin's gonna do. Let Putin worry about what we're gonna do. And that's satisfying for 5 minutes, but then you worry that because we're not quite sure what we're dealing with Putin. I mean, you're not sure of what he's capable of, and whether, you know, there's that great expression, selling wolf tickets. Do you know that expression? It's a black ghetto expression. It says, well, he's just selling wolf tickets, you know, meaning he's just making empty threats. Don't you think that's a terrific expression?
Yeah.
He's selling wolf tickets. But we don't know whether he's just selling wolf tickets or whether, you know, he's the wolf. I think Biden is proceeding cautiously, and it seems to me, to answer your question, that we're doing quite a bit. I don't know what. It's a maddening situation. It's absolutely maddening to be at the mercy, and to see the Ukrainians at the mercy of this kind of behavior. But realistically, it seems to me that one has to be sober about bravado will only get you the next beer. You know, you might pay a price for it. So I would be careful.
Well, I just want to thank you, Lance. I feel there's so much here for all of us to digest and to think about. And I know Lance is going to be here for a little while because we have his books here, and he's going to be signing books. I'm going to have a chair right here for him, so we don't have to leave. But I just want to take this moment to thank you very much for
Quite welcome, and thank you
an
so much.
interesting program.
Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it.